guys, this is Dr. Novo from the Lifters Clinic. Today it's just going to be me. I'm putting together a real quick little video to just specifically talk about hand position in the front rack. So a lot of times it's quite difficult to have a nice full grip on the bar, meaning once I'm in position, it might be difficult for some of you to get that full hand on the bar, and you might have to resort to just using a fingertip position on it. Now, most of the time we make the assumption that this is coming really from lack of wrist extension, but in all honesty, a lot of it is coming from the actual shoulder external rotation. So we have some drills that we've covered in the past, right? Taking my PVC pipe, bringing it around, using some of this active contraction against, then relaxation to pull into position, ensuring that I'm up here in a nice top front rack position. So that's where my arms will be, right, with the barbell. But we also need to focus on strengthening, right? So strengthening the arm to pull itself into that position is, in my opinion, the other half, right, of that puzzle. We can only tug and yank on things to get into position for so long before we really have to come to the realization that we have to be able to develop enough control, which is another way of describing strength, to hold ourselves into that position. So we do want to, as a warm-up, engage these muscles, and these are going to be muscles that are part of the rotator cuff. And we also want to be able to make sure that we can fit in some work on the back end, which could also be, you know, your quote grunt work, which is going to be done again to focus in on the rotator cuff, but maybe more ideally and more specifically in the ranges that we're going to need to get better at this. Meaning, i.e., if I'm doing rotator cuff stuff down here, you know, this position is not very specific for this position, right? I need to be able to work my rotator cuff up in this upward position, and the same thing, I need to probably work it in this position because that's where I will ultimately be, right, when I go ahead and end up in this overhead position. I'm going to have enough strength, right, and control as that bar comes up to control that external rotation and land in that catch position, all right? So I'm going to go ahead and show you some very simple drills that we can do and make sure that all of you are doing it, okay? So we're going to head on over to the crossover symmetry setup, where everything's already done for you. All you got to do is maybe make a few adjustments as to where those clips are going to be when you arrive, and let's get to it. All right, so we are now over at the crossover symmetry station. One of the best tools that we can apply to the shoulder is not only going to be resistances in one plane, but resistance through two planes of motion. And the reason being for that is because we live in a three-plane of motion world, right? 3D. And the shoulder, because it's a ball and socket joint, operates through all three planes of motion anytime it moves. That means as my arm is going into flexion, I'm also having rotation in a separate plane and rotation in another plane. So all three motions are occurring right in that ball and socket joint to accommodate for space, meaning that ball can't simply just roll. It has to be able to roll, glide, and then also work through another arc of motion in order to make sure that it is maintaining what we call in the world of biomechanics congruency. That just means nice seated position right in the center of the joint. Now, this doesn't happen passively, meaning I can't tug and pull myself into good congruency. I have to be able to control or have some strength to keep myself in congruency, which is, again, a really big hallmark for using your crossover symmetry as often as you can. When you first come into the gym, spend a little bit of time over here. Just before you're done with your session, come back and spend a little bit of time. The volume of work you need directly to these muscle groups that control that shoulder are much greater than the ones you need for controlling the hip, because the hip naturally sits deep into the pelvis, whereas the shoulder sits basically on a flat surface, almost considering the shoulders like having like a softball sitting on a golf tee, right? So there's a lot of control needed for this shoulder joint. So we want to make sure that adequately every week we have a sufficient amount of volume devoted towards that. All right, so now that I've done my job of educating you as to the why, let's go through some of the how. So with these bands, a couple great positions, again, we want to work into is we want to make sure that we are adequately targeting this, what we call frontal external rotation or frontal plane external rotation, because this is going to allow us to get better into that position so that I'm not so narrow, requiring only fingertip contact, right? If I can go ahead and externally rotate better, you can see naturally how my hand can come into better position on that bar versus being here, all right? And equally, if I'm starting from here as I press up, the likelihood is that I will press up and I will over-recruit to get into that under the bar position, as opposed to if I'm externally rotated, I can more adequately pull myself into the bottom and push the bar up, and I'll end up with a more uniform position where that bar is balanced. And obviously I've also gained better control of that shoulder so that when I get to the top, I don't have to use a locking mechanism of the ligaments of the shoulder to hold the bar. I can use an actual strength and structured position to hold the bar. So with a crossover symmetry, I'm gonna go ahead and start with the lightest band just for demonstration. But the idea would be that I'm gonna do this first on a single arm approach, and I'll show you the double arm. So single arm approach, obviously I'm held in front rack position. We would have a little bit more tension, which would mean I'd have to walk out of the frame, but you'll have an idea. My starting range, where I already have some tension, should be about this 45-degree angle. From here, I'm gonna pull myself out to 90 and slightly beyond and come on back, okay? This is one progression. This is where I'm just opening and closing, right, that hinge. As I get stronger at this, I might want to challenge it with more time under tension, which essentially would be me starting up at 90 and doing a very long walkout. I actually would be walking out of the frame and holding that position for time to really fatigue my, my rotator cuff out in order to make sure that I'm also not just working the strength component of it, but I'm also working the endurance capacity, because mind you, in CrossFit, we have a lot of back-to-back exercises or movements or stations or events that are going to require us to be able to recover very quickly. So we have to train for that specific outcome, which means we do have to exhaust the muscle during our training. Now for warm-up, I definitely would just suggest doing an open and closing door mechanism, anywhere from just 3 sets of as low as 8, as high as 15 reps would be adequate. That's going to really help to warm up that tissue, draw some blood into the tissue, and help it to not receive as much damage due to training, because it's already basically warmed up. This second warm-up drill would be to take my bands, drop them to the bottommost rung, now cross them over, and now I'm going to be working the bottom of that range through that motion, which is where we're going to have the biggest risk really for the shoulder to receive any sort of damage. You have to understand that a lot of times the injury comes not just from the acceleration, but it's the inability to control, right, and decelerate the motion to make sure that where we end up is in a solid congruent position as we push out. All right, guys, hopefully this wasn't too long of a video and it was direct on what you needed. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them on the bottom. Obviously, likes and shares are much appreciated. And if you do need any direct and specific work, you know where to find me. For the current time being, I'm right across the hall, or right across the parking lot, over at the therapy gym. And for anybody who's watching this in the internet world, if you do want any specifics on programming, you can reach out to me, Mario@liftersclinic.com, and I can go ahead and help you to answer any questions that you have there. Yeah, so everybody, have some great training, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.